highest, and that's because coastal waters you get a lot more mixing. But in terms of open ocean productivity, the purple here is very low. Those are the low oxygenated, very poor oxygen, very poor turnover waters of the tropics. These waters in the Southern Ocean are unique because you have this band entirely around the Antarctic that is never interrupted. It's never stopped. It's the Great Circumpolar Current, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, pushes more water than in any other current in the world. This current causes upwellings, in particular as the bodies of water hit any kind of seafloor element, or in the case of the Galapagos, as they hit the west side of South America and travel up the coast of South America, making the Humboldt Current and feeding the northernmost penguin of the world. So effectively, even though this is absolutely, the Galapagos penguin is absolutely a tropical penguin, it is feeding, more or less directly on productivity that comes from the cold water that peels off the Antarctic. A bit about their flights and their travels. If you think sometimes, you're going to think about dinner and, shoot, I forgot to pick up whatever at the grocery store, and you whip on down, and 5 minutes later you have that thing from the grocery store. This is a wandering albatross from Bird Island, the northern tip of South Georgia. 2,600 miles round trip to the coast of Brazil in one feeding trip. That's pretty typical. It's kind of, honey, I'm just going to run down to the store. A whole different thing. This is a track that was published in Carl Safina's book, Eye of the Albatross. I love that book. Really, really excellent. For how it gives you this, in reading it, you really get this sense of what makes these birds tick. And I'm fond of this because it's a 2-week GPS satellite tracked Laysan albatross that left from Midway Island. 2 weeks later, it come back. It had traveled, I think, some 1,800 miles, and it got back. It sat down and fed its chick, and the chick settled down and slept for 15 minutes and stood up again, and the bird fed its chick again, and then the adult got up and took off for another 5 days. So, there you have, this is not, back to that whole point, this is not coming back to land. This is taking time out from its habitat to get to its chick and feeding it in between. They work on very much a razor's edge of the ability to gather enough food and feed to raise a chick and fledge a chick. It's not too terribly difficult. I mean, anyone who's any woman who's had a baby knows it's a whole different gig energetically to just maintain yourself versus growing a baby, lactating, feeding a baby. That's the same for the albatross. When they're in their off season, when they're just feeding themselves, that's pretty easy. But when they suddenly have to turn around and raise a chick, it's a whole different level. And what you see with these birds through the breeding season is that they will go on short feeding flights to deliver food to their young. But in that time, they're wasting away. They're burning their own reserves. And then occasionally doing longer feeding flights, which nurture themselves. In the time when the chick is the youngest, mortality is highest, at least until the chick fledges. And they're having to make more shorter trips. They have to come into the breeding season with a lot of fat reserves. Then as things get, as the chick gets older, they can do more flights further north, back to this, it's up in these areas near, in the case of Midway Island, near Midway, they're picking up flying fish roe and such like that don't feed them, but they can feed to their chicks. When they get up towards the Aleutian Islands, then they're feeding themselves, digesting some for themselves, and then bringing home food for their chicks. Very different feeding strategy for the penguins, which are out there picking up individual fish one at a time, individual krill. So a little bit about feeding techniques. You've got a whole range here, and the albatross, the seabirds are kind of at one end of the scale. If you look at open ocean feeding techniques, on one extreme you have the industrial fishing vessels of the ocean, which are the whales. We were sitting around breakfast the other day just doing some back of the envelope math and figured out that a blue whale can take into its mouth, this is the humpback, but blue can take into its mouth at one time a volume of water basically equal to its weight. That's a space of water that's about 20 feet by 20 feet by 10 feet. Imagine a room 20 feet across. If you're standing in it, you and everything in that room could be inside the mouth of a blue whale. Couldn't really swallow you. They don't have big throats, but they have big mouths. And a very efficient net as well. They close that mouth, baleen, which is keratin, same stuff as our hair and our fingernails. It closes over the mouth. They filter it out, scoop up the inside, basically pushing water out with their tongue. They have these fantastic feeding techniques here. Again, all these are humpbacks. Bubble net feeding, I'm sure many of you have seen this. Super effective. Here's that blue whale that's taking a 20 by 20 foot room. If you were standing on this blue whale's jaw, you'd be about yay big, I think. Like that. In the middle of that this spectrum of feeding techniques are the seals, and then more to that industrial feeding analogy. The blue whales, they will go to the polar latitudes where the feeding is best, and they will put on feet of blubber, and then travel somewhere, oftentimes thousands of miles away, and give birth to their calves, deliver to their calves, in the case of a humpback whale, something like 800 pounds of milk a day, so that that baby can put on 100 pounds a day. Very industrial in terms of the scale of their processing of food. In the middle is a crab eater seal, and these are supposedly the most numerous seals in the world. And I tend to believe that they probably are so because the Southern Ocean has far less whales than it used to. They have a pretty cool little set of equivalent of baleen, not nearly as efficient. They take a mouthful. They're called crab eaters, but they actually eat krill as well. They take a mouthful of krill, and they have these fluted teeth, and that essentially forms the same kind of filter as the baleen. And krill being the ultimate in Southern Ocean food. This is actually my father's photo. It turns out that the massive predator of a leopard seal, it too depends actually quite a lot of the year on krill, and you can tell because it too has these fluted teeth. Not so dedicated as is the crab eater seal, but it works out pretty well because in the non-breeding season the penguins disperse, and these guys are left to fend for themselves finding krill. Actually, this penguin was okay, or at least it walked away, more or less. It came ashore and it was looking a little beaten up, but still walking, still swimming. But it works out pretty well for these guys who are at the other end of the stream. These guys are picking off individual krill, individual lanternfish, mostly in the case of king penguins. They don't digest it and process the food and give milk to their young. Of course, they're bringing back the more or less raw food in various stages of digestion to their young, and it works out very well for them in terms of numbers. Actually, it seems to me that king penguins of all species are maybe benefiting from current state of climate change, which has moved the polar front and mixing zone of water. It seems to have moved it closer to South Georgia, so they don't seem to have to swim as far. But that same story doesn't go for many other species. These birds will, in the breeding season, depending on the species, make daily trips out where they're going 10, 15 miles or something like that, to weekly trips going dozens to hundreds of miles. They're flying as they travel across their breeding grounds, their feeding grounds rather, flying through the water. They porpoise for the efficiency of it because water is so viscous. They, as it turns out, can store a little bit of air in amongst their feathers, and in the moment of need, when they need a burst of speed, squeeze a little bit of air out, and that actually makes them a little bit of a slipstream and get a burst of speed. Pretty fantastic stuff, but not traveling more than a few hundred miles. By contrast, of course, the albatross are taking it to extremes. The flight statistics for a gray-headed albatross going out to feed its young as much as 13,000 miles round trip, 13,000 kilometers round trip to bring back essentially a couple of meals for their young. And what that talks about is the distance is effectively a cost of near zero, only the time involved. There's no effort to travel these distances, it's just the time involved, because they are effectively flying, traveling for free on the wind. Some interesting segregation within species, for example, wandering albatross leaving South Georgia, one of their key breeding sites, the males tend to go further south, the females tend to go further north. Unfortunately, because there's disproportionate fishing effort further north, the females are meeting up with a little bit more trouble and creating a bit of a skewed sex ratio in the species. So getting on to that whole feeding question, these birds, like I said, they're traveling in a desert, so when there's a concentration of food, they come to it quickly, and it's almost, I tend to think, they have incredible senses of smell. Actually, on a voyage where we're not allowed to feed the birds south of a certain latitude, but there's no reason we can't tempt the birds with a little bit of smell. We have taken like a rag and dipped it in cooking oil and hung it off the back of the ship, and it's amazing the number of birds that come in just like checking it out. Obviously they're not seeing anything, they're just smelling a little bit of fish cooked oil. When you are actually have something legitimate for them to come after, this is off the back of a fishing trawler in the Southern Ocean, not my photos, a fellow named Graham Robertson took these, and I took this one anyway. The birds, actually some species of albatross have benefited by fishing vessels, those that manage to avoid the lines and such, but are getting access to food that they wouldn't normally have access to, coming in by the hundreds and thousands. And it's in this little space that sometimes I've been able to see just how adept they are. This bird was sitting behind our boat, a white-capped albatross, and it was basically surfing. I wish I could surf and glide. I kite surf a lot, and I really love it, but I could never do what this bird was doing, which is in the eddy of wind behind the boat, it was basically holding its wings there, keeping its feet on the surface of the water, just holding position until a piece of food came out, grab that food, and then lift back up into this kind of kite surfing position. It was very, very impressive. And actually this one bird was the most successful in grabbing the food that was coming off the back of her boat, and it was the only bird that was apparently doing this little surfing technique. Typically these birds are very, very safe from human disruption. Their breeding sites, for the most part, are very safe in some of the absolutely most inhospitable places in the world. This is a black-browed and gray-headed albatross breeding site called Willis Island, just north of South Georgia, at the northern end of South Georgia. But, nothing is hurting these birds there. but we have no bounds or limits in our appetites for fish and seafood products. So even while fishing has only really penetrated these waters in the last 50 years, these waters are thoroughly penetrated at this point. And so fishing vessels working, there's nothing about these oceans that's too rough for fishing. And this fish in particular has really kind of thrown a big monkey wrench into the feeding strategies of these birds. Chilean sea bass, which is a long line fished, it's a bottom dwelling fish. Its real common name is Patagonian toothfish. Nobody seemed to like it by that name, so he gave it the name Chilean sea bass, and it suddenly turned into this white gold. And when they're cleaning fish on the back of a vessel, this is what it looks like behind the vessel. It's just absolute frenzy. Albatross here, black-browed albatross mostly. There's a wanderer right there. Giant petrels. I don't see any other species in there real quick. Northern hemisphere here, northern fulmar, and that's all fine and great, you know, a little bit of offal, no big deal, a bunch of scavengers, that's fine, but when the fishing vessel is setting its lines, it drops a baited hook off the back, and when we say setting lines, we're talking about lines that are miles and miles long. That baited hook, if the bird dives on it and grabs it, here you can see, I'm sorry, it's a pretty low resolution image, but there's a line coming out of the back of that bird, and unfortunately that bird is soon to be dead, and then go under and drown, and that's pretty much that. And it kind of just doesn't work too well for the fishermen either, because they don't really want to catch an albatross. They lost a bait, you know, they lost a potential fish on that hook, and if the fishing, well, so there's a couple kinds of longline fishing, and this is probably the big banner issue for most of these seabirds. Real quickly on the technology, we're talking about, in some cases, 100 kilometers of line. Open ocean, and what's called surface long lining. This is what's done for tuna and swordfish, so a couple of the least sustainably managed fisheries in the world. Of course, that's a huge overgeneralization, but here you're putting hooks out 50 to 300 meters underwater, bottom long lining, dropping hooks down to usually to a shelf around an island or a seamount, that kind of thing, 2,000 meters down, a couple kilometers, a mile down. These are the critical issues, because birds are getting caught on these lines, going down and drowning. Many of the population's precipitous decline has slowed, and in some cases turned around as management has improved. But this is really the heart of the matter. There are definitely a lot of other issues that these birds face. No conservation issue is quite that simple. And on Midway Island, there's an introduced species that will literally grow over an animal. They grow so fast that they can actually trap a bird on its nest. They're so concerned about introduced species there that you're not allowed to wear any clothes that aren't new when you go to Midway Island. It's pretty excellent how controlled it is now. That can come out very clean. But introduced rats, introduced other pests are a major issue in some places for some species. There's some wonderful work going on here. This is South Georgia Island, where the northern 2/3 has now been cleared of rats in the middle of the greatest rat eradication project ever to happen on the planet. So I'm really humbled and pleased to have been involved in the fundraising for this. We take great pains to not introduce rats wherever we go. More for the tropical species, not so much for the Southern Ocean species. Trash, this sort of thing, is birds getting caught up in trash, and worst of all, ingesting trash. This is a big issue out in Midway and such, where this is the stomach of a chick that eventually died with a full stomach. Its contents of its stomach ending up, you know, it's absolutely full and yet starving. that's affecting these guys, black-footed and Laysan albatross. And ultimately, in the long term, what may be the greatest issue for some of these birds is the big unknown, is climate change, where we're seeing in years with very low sea ice in the Antarctic, a lot of things fail. Each season after a low sea ice year, the krill abundance in South Georgia is very poor, and the consequence of that is that Gen 2 penguins don't successfully breed. There's so many questions and unknowns with this, but there are a few really obvious trends. The Antarctic Peninsula, Gen 2 penguins are moving south at about 1 kilometer per year. Adelie penguins, on the other hand, are crashing. Sites that we used to take folks to, we don't go to anymore, because the 3,000 Adelie penguins that used to be there are now like 30, which is, you know, just not quite so fun to see. And we tend to think of conservation oftentimes as this local issue. Yeah, protect their breeding grounds, and for the rat issues and introduced species, that's really key. But for these seabirds, we just have to think in a whole different world. I mean, unfortunately, we have to think in terms of management of some of these species. It's great that the government of South Georgia manages their waters very, very tightly. However, a gray-headed albatross in the non-breeding season, it's checking out the feeding off of Tasmania, New Zealand, you know, open ocean feeding grounds. No problem for this bird at all to go around the world in its non-breeding season. Here is the travel of a wandering albatross over 38 days after leaving South Georgia before the satellite tag ran out of batteries, nearly to Australia in the course of that little over a month. Sailing boats can do that in less time, but they don't do that while feeding off the ocean and expending absolutely zero energy. So working with the winds that, you know, are terrifying us, and you know, dealing with conditions that are absolutely humbling. These birds, this was a midsummer day, but a rather windy midsummer day. These are king penguins huddled into a little bit of a crash, and you know, and the wind stops, and they shake their heads and go back to whatever, just hanging out and molting. They can deal with these climates. They can deal with, you know, the relatively solid bones of a penguin. Of course, birds have hollow bones, but these birds' bones have filled back in with a meshwork of calcium that allows them to get battered into rocks on their way into shore. Obviously, this fantastic you know, breeding strategies allow them to deal with competition as well with these massive animals, and doing so, I have to say, from a far less scientific but aesthetic point, with absolute grace and beauty. I mean, the beauty of these animals, from the details to where they live. I guess the experience of that for me has really drawn me to, you know, look at the face of this wandering albatross chick and this bird that, for all I knew, this was this bird's first time ever off of its nest as it, after overwintering, you know, was getting ready to fledge. These sorts of things, you know, I just kind of can't go away thinking that they're doomed. So very pleasantly, there are, you know, the typical slightly conservation-oriented talk has this sort of doom and gloom at the end, but happily there are really some great solutions. Here, what you have here are, it's really hard to see, but here's the fishing line going out, right? Here's that long line going out, and instead of that mass of birds flooding around the stern of the ship, there's the albatross back up in the corners, not coming in and not grabbing the line. This is the sort of thing that legal fishing operations are doing. Unfortunately, quite a lot of the fishing in the Southern Ocean is illegal, undocumented, and pirate operation. You know, certain waters are well controlled. The island, the territorial waters of South Georgia, the territorial waters of Falkland Islands. If there's a fishing vessel found there, that fishing vessel is seized and cleaned out and sunk. and gone, which is fantastic. You know, and they have a legal fishing regime there, which is actually the major source of revenue for the government of South Georgia. But that's just a tiny little piece of the territory of the Antarctic. However, you know, in their management of fishing, as they were starting to try to really, you know, sell fishing licenses, but do it well, do it right. In their first couple of years, 96, 97, they were losing some 3,000 albatross and other birds getting caught on lines. As they implemented a handful of things, putting those lines out behind their ships, dyeing bait so that it's blue instead of white as it goes underwater, only fishing in the non-breeding season when the birds aren't as voracious, when they're not trying to raise that chick, setting the lines at night. Their mortality dropped down to 30 by 2001, and in the last 5 years it's like they get 1 or 2 birds killed every couple of years, which is near on zero, which from 3,000 birds, that's pretty fantastic. However, the flip side of this is you have, you know, many nations, many management regimes. There was an effort recently to turn this whole area into a protected zone, protected ocean with no fishing. It failed. It's the second effort, actually, well, it's a series of, long-term series of efforts, but unfortunately China from Russia stonewalled this one. Really frustrating to see that. But, you know, that's the second time that we've really tried that. The U.S. and New Zealand were the 2 champions of it, I'm proud to say. You know, it's exactly perfect on an international scale, but on that front, we were fighting the good fight. And when I think about this bird going out to sea here, white-capped albatross, leaving from subantarctic island off of New Zealand and heading out and going into this uncertain world where, you know, he's got thousands of miles in which he's got to find some food and bring it back. Well, I want this bird, you know, I want it to be able to come home to its partner. You know, back in the day, this is I shot the albatross. Well, we don't do that anymore, but if we, by contrast, are going out and just buying whatever fish is cheapest or buying, swordfish, yeah, it's really good. But, you know, if we are supporting industries that are not doing fishing sustainably or not working to protect, you know, what we really need are big ocean reserves that are free of fishing. What we really need are, you know, less trash going into the sea. Effectively, we're doing the same thing, shooting the albatross. There's a place for these birds, and I think that the world should be big enough for it. So with that, thank you.